Wrong ceiling. That was the first thought. Not where am I, not what happened. Just, that ceiling is wrong. Too high. Stone, not concrete. A brass chandelier with half-burned candles. Morning light coming through a window I've never seen before. I tried to sit up. My arms gave out. I looked at my hands. Thin. The skin almost translucent, blue veins running underneath like rivers on a map. A child's hands. I watched them shake and felt nothing. No pain, no weight. Like someone had hollowed me out and left only the shell. I opened my mouth to speak. A high, cracked sound came out. Not my voice. Then the memories hit. Not slowly. All at once. 14 years of another life crashing into me like a wave. Carl Blumenthal. Born in this room. Mother died in this room, 3 hours after he did. Father sat in the chair by the window for 2 days afterward and didn't eat. Governess Lees, who changed the cold cloths on his forehead every night for 5 years. The smell of fever medicine. The sound of his own coughing, which he'd lived with so long it had become background noise, like wind. 5 years of illness. The last 8 months almost entirely bedridden. I lay still and let it settle. Carl Blumenthal was 14 years old, heir to a failing estate, and he had just died in his sleep. And I was using his body. I stood up on the third try. The legs worked. That surprised me. I'd expected weakness, and there was weakness, the kind that comes from months in bed, but the fever was gone. The pressure in my chest that Carl had lived with so long he'd forgotten what breathing without it felt like. Gone. I crossed the room slowly, one hand on the wall, and stopped at the window. Outside, fields. A dirt road. 3 horses tied to a post near a stone well. The door opened. Lise came in with a tray, a clay cup, a small cloth, the morning medicine Carl no longer needed. She looked up. The tray hit the floor. She didn't move for 3 full seconds, just stood there with her hands still in the position of holding something. Young master. Her voice was barely a sound. You're standing. 2 more maids appeared in the doorway behind her. One of them started crying immediately, before she even understood why. I turned from the window. In the mirror across the room, I could see what they saw. Pale, thin, dark circles under the eyes. But upright, breathing clearly. I'm hungry, I said. Bring food. A lot of it. They laughed, all 3 of them, through the tears. It was the most human sound I'd heard since I woke up. Heinrich Blumenthal didn't knock. He was a large man who had learned to move quietly, the way people do when they've spent years trying not to disturb a sick child. He came through the door and stopped. Then he crossed the room in 4 steps and held me, carefully, like I might break, and didn't say anything for a long time. I let him. He was crying. He wasn't embarrassed about it. Then came the knock. Father straightened. Something in his face changed, not just sadness, but the specific look of a man who already knows what the news is and has been dreading it for weeks. The messenger was young, dusty from the road. He held his hat and spoke to the floor. Debt, grain stores, failed harvest, and a name, Count Eisenstadt, who had been quietly purchasing the estate's outstanding obligations for the past 6 months. For 1,000 gold, due in 3 months. Current income, 200 per year. Current expenses, 600 per year. I did the math before the messenger finished speaking. Stop, I said. The messenger stopped. Father looked at me. Numbers. Total debt, total deadline, total number of working people on the estate. Silence. Everyone in the room stared at the 14-year-old boy who had been bedridden for 5 years and was now asking for a financial report. Father answered quietly. For 1,000 gold. 90 days. 80 people, roughly. I nodded. Father reached for his coat. I'll ride to Eisenstadt in the morning. Ask for an extension. He may, no. He stopped. Give me 1 day first, I said. I want to see what we actually have before we go begging for time. Father looked at me for a long moment. The man who had sat by this bed for 5 years, who had watched his son shrink down to almost nothing, who had run out of plans months ago. All right, he said. One day, Kurt had been managing the Blumenthal estate for 11 years. He was a thin man in his 50s with the posture of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it had bent him permanently forward. He rode beside me that morning with the expression of a doctor accompanying a patient who had insisted on leaving the hospital too soon. Young master, perhaps we should keep going, I said. Show me everything. He showed me everything. The quarry came first, a wide cut in the hillside 2 kilometers east of the main house. The face of it overgrown with grass at the edges, the entrance blocked by a collapsed wooden beam that nobody had bothered to clear. Abandoned 6 years ago, Kurt said. The foreman left. Nobody wanted the work after that. I looked at the quarry. Good stone, clearly cut, the face still clean. The collapse was one beam, maybe two. I could see the shape of the rock underneath. Free material. Needs one competent person and some labor. The bridge. I said, show me. We crossed to the river. Or rather, we crossed to where the bridge had been. 2 stone foundations on opposite banks, and between them, nothing. The river ran fast and brown, 30 meters wide. Flood 2 years ago, Kurt said. The Zaltzmer's trade road used to come through here. Now the merchants go around. 30 kilometers out of their way. I looked at the foundations. They were solid. Whoever built the original bridge knew what they were doing. The footings were cut deep, no erosion. Building a new span wouldn't mean starting over. It would mean finishing someone else's work. 30 kilometers of detour. Every merchant who makes that detour is paying time and axle, where instead of paying me a toll. The marsh, I said. Kurt's expression shifted to something approaching genuine distress. Young master, it's not safe to. From the edge. I don't need to go in. We rode to the southern boundary. The marsh stretched for perhaps a kilometer, dark water between islands of thick grass. The smell of sulfur faint in the morning air. Willows at the edges. Frogs. The sound of something moving in the reeds. Useless land, Kurt said. Has always been useless. The peasants won't go near it. I looked at the color of the soil at the marsh's edge where it met dry ground. Black. Dense. The kind of soil that forms over centuries of decomposing organic matter. Drain it, and you have the best farmland in 50 kilometers. The sulfur smell is a problem to solve, not a reason to walk away. The empty village, I said. Niederbach. Maybe 12 families left. The rest left during the plague 2 years ago, or after. The houses. Standing. Mostly. Empty houses. Standing. 12 families in a village built for 40. We rode for 4 hours. Kurt talked. I listened to what he wasn't saying. By the time we turned back toward the main house, I had the shape of it in my head. 80 peasants. 5 villages, 3 of them half empty. Fields 40% planted, the rest fallow. Quarry abandoned. Bridge gone. Marsh untouched. Roads that turned to mud in the rain and broke cart axles in the dry season. Debt, for 1,000 gold. Income, 200 per year. Expenses, 600 per year. Cash, 40 gold, which I had found that morning in the strongbox under father's desk. Minus 400 per year and minus 4,000 in 90 days. I said it out loud, mostly to hear how it sounded. That's not a crisis. That's a problem with a shape. Kurt stared at me. Problems with a shape can be solved, I said. Right on. We came into the first village, Unnerfeld, the closest to the main house, and I stopped. The smell hit first. Down the center of the main path, between the houses, ran a shallow trench. It wasn't a drainage ditch. It wasn't a canal. It was an open sewer, slow-moving, running directly past the doors of 6 houses and ending somewhere behind the mill in a low pit that clearly hadn't been emptied in months. The village well was 8 meters away. I sat on my horse and looked at this for a long time. Kurt. Yes, young master. Do the people here drink from that well? Yes. Always have. And in summer, how often do people get sick? He paused. Every summer. The children especially. We lost for last year. 2 the year before. I looked at the well. 8 meters. The trench ran slightly downhill toward it. Not directly, but close enough. Close enough for groundwater. Close enough for everything that shouldn't be in a water supply to find its way there slowly, invisibly, over years. This is why the population isn't recovering. The plague killed them fast and visibly. This is killing them slow and quietly, every summer, and nobody has connected the two things because you can't see it happening. First priority, I said. Not the bridge. Not the quarry. This. Kurt blinked. The ditch. Proper drainage. Stone-lined, covered where it passes near the well, redirected downhill to a collection point away from the water supply. All 3 main villages. That will take labor and stone. We have both. I turned the horse. Who was the best builder on the estate? Kurt thought for a moment. Werner. Old Werner, in the East Village. Used to be a master mason before his back went. He still does repairs when we need them. Take me to Werner. We went to Werner's house on the way back, but between the village and the east road, we passed the fields. I stopped again. The grain was planted in long rows running east to west, and from the slight rise of the road, I could see the whole pattern clearly. The western half of the main field was dense and green, the stalks thick. The eastern half was pale, yellowish at the tips. The rows were thinner, uneven, the soil between them cracked and pale. Same seed, I said. Yes, young master. Same planting time. What's different about the east half? Kurt considered this. Nothing, I think. The soil is perhaps a little higher there. The river. I could see it from here. The Bloomin' River, running north to south, for 100 meters west of the field. The western half of the field sat in the river's natural floodplain. In wet years, the water reached it. In dry years, the groundwater was still close enough to pull from. The eastern half sat on a slight rise, out of reach of both. How much of the harvest do you lose to the dry half? A third in a good year, half in a bad one. A third to half of the harvest. Every year. Because the river is 400 meters away and nobody has dug the 400 meters of channels that would end it permanently. After the drainage, I said. Irrigation. Channels from the river with wooden sluice gates. Adjustable by season. Kurt said nothing. How much does a bad harvest cost us? I said. Last year, perhaps 120 gold in lost grain. And how much would channels cost? I don't know. I've never. Labor and stone, I said again. Same answer. Father was waiting in the main hall when we returned. He had spent the day alone, which meant he had spent the day worrying. There was a cup of cold tea on the table in front of him that he clearly hadn't touched. I sat down across from him and spread the paper I'd been writing on during the ride. Notes, numbers, the rough sketch of the estate's layout that I'd drawn from memory when we stopped to water the horses. Here's what we have, I said, and here is what we do with it. I laid it out in order. First, drainage. The open sewer in Unterfeld and the two closest villages was killing people slowly. Sick peasants don't plant fields, don't build roads, don't pay rents. The estate's population had been declining for 2 years not only because of the plague, because of this. Stone from the quarry, which cost nothing to open except labor. Channels dug by hand, downhill by gravity. No machinery required. Cost, 15 gold for tools and materials. Timeline, 6 weeks. Second, irrigation. For 100 meters of channels from the river to the dry half of the main field. Wooden sluice gates at 3 points for seasonal control. This recovers a third to half of the annual harvest. On current numbers, 80 to 120 gold per year, every year, permanently. Cost, labor and stone. Timeline, 8 weeks after drainage is complete. Third, the bridge. The Salzmers Road brought 40 to 60 merchant convoys through this region every month before the bridge went down. Each convoy now adds 30 kilometers to avoid us. Rebuild the bridge. The foundations are solid, it's one span, and charge a toll. 3 gold for a heavy wagon, 1 for a light cart. First month of traffic, conservatively, 25 gold. Every month after that. Fourth, the quarry. Once the bridge is generating income, open the quarry properly. Stone for sale, stone for construction. 1 skilled foreman, 5 workers. This funds everything else. Father listened to all of it without speaking. When I finished, he looked at the paper for a long time. We have 40 gold, he said finally. Yes. The drainage costs 15. That leaves 25. That's enough to start the bridge while drainage is in progress. I paused. It won't be comfortable. If something breaks in the first 2 months, we have no reserve. But if we wait until we feel safe, Eisenstadt will have our debt and our land before we're ready to move. Carl. Father's voice was careful. You've been in bed for, I know, I said. I know how long I've been in bed. He looked at me. Something in his face shifted, not suspicion, not quite belief. Something between the two, the expression of a man who had prayed for something for a long time and wasn't sure yet if this was the answer or a different kind of pain. Werner, I said. Tell me where to find him. Tomorrow morning, I have a drawing to show him. The drawing took me 2 hours the night before. I didn't have proper drafting tools, just a quill, a ruler Kurt found in the steward's office, and the back of an old land survey. But I knew what I needed to show. The slope of the terrain through Unterfeld, the position of the well, the line of the new drainage channel running south and downhill to a collection pit 50 meters past the last house. Stone-lined walls. A wooden cover over the section nearest the well. 3 inspection points. Werner's house was at the far end of the East Village. Stone walls, thatched roof. A small forge that he clearly used for something other than horseshoes based on the organized collection of iron tools hanging outside. He was in the yard when we arrived, doing something to a wooden beam with a hand plane, his back bent at the angle Kurt had described. Not broken, just permanent. He didn't look up when I dismounted. "Werner," Kurt said, "I heard you coming." He kept planing. "What does the young master need fixed?" I walked over and put the drawing on the workbench beside him. He stopped. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he picked it up, turned it slightly toward the morning light, and looked at it some more. His eyes moved across the lines slowly, the way an experienced man reads something in his own language. "This is a drainage system," he said. "Yes. For Unterfeld. And Mittelbach and Sudfeld after. Starting with Unterfeld." He looked at the channel line. "By gravity. You've used the slope. The terrain drops 4 meters from the north end of the village to the collection pit. Enough to move everything without pumping." "Depth," he said. 1.2 meters. He set the drawing down. 1 meter is enough. In summer. In winter, the ground freezes to 80 centimeters in a hard year. At 1 meter, the channel freezes solid, and you're back to the open ditch by February. Werner was quiet for a moment. He picked up the drawing again. "Who taught you to think about frost depth?" "I read," I said. Another silence. He set the drawing down a final time, carefully, squaring it against the edge of the workbench. "The stone," he said. "From the quarry?" "Yes. I'll have a crew clearing the entrance this week. I'll need 6 men who can follow directions. You'll have 8. He nodded once. The way a man nods when he's already decided and is just confirming the details. "I'll want to walk the line first. This afternoon, if the young master is available. I'll be there," I said. He picked up his hand plane again. That was the whole conversation. No flattery, no ceremony, no questions about whether I was sure or whether father had approved or whether I was feeling well enough after my illness. Werner had looked at the drawing, found it correct, and agreed to build it. That was worth more than a month of speeches. I found her by accident. I was walking through the grain storage barn on the east side of the main yard, taking inventory, counting sacks, trying to reconcile Kurt's numbers with what I could actually see, when I heard someone already counting in the back. She was standing on a wooden crate to reach the upper row of shelves, marking a tally on a piece of slate with a piece of chalk. 19 years old, dark hair pulled back, a smear of dust across one cheek. She didn't stop counting when she heard me come in. 43 sacks winter rye, she said, mostly to herself. Not 47. Kurt's numbers are wrong again. She climbed down and saw me. She didn't bow. I looked at the slate in her hand. Neat columns, grain type, count, estimated weight, location in the barn. Better organized than anything I'd seen in the steward's office. "You're doing Kurt's job?" I said. "Someone has to." She said it without hostility, just as a fact. "He counts what he expects to find. I count what's actually there." "How long have you been doing this?" "Since my father died. 8 months. She set the slate on a nearby barrel. He was the village headman in Niederbach. He kept the records. When he died, the records stopped. I started keeping them again because nobody else would. For what? Nobody was paying you. For the same reason you walk a field before it floods, she said. So you know what you have. I looked at her for a moment. I need someone to keep records for the whole estate, I said. Not just the grain barn. Everything. People, materials, money, labor. Every project that starts, every cost, every result. Kurt won't like that. Kurt doesn't have to like it. She picked up the slate again, looked at it, set it back down. What do I get? 5% of any income you help create. Directly to you. Not to your household. Not to a credit. To you, in coin. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly. Closer to the look of someone who has been offered a reasonable deal and is checking it for the obvious trap. 5% of what, specifically? Of the increase. If the estate earns 200 gold this year and 400 next year, you get 10 gold. If it stays at 200, you get nothing extra. And if it goes down, then we both have bigger problems than your percentage. She thought about it for longer than I expected, not hesitating, calculating. Then she said, I'll need access to all the accounts. Kurt's books, the steward's ledger, the household records. You'll have them. And I'll need you to tell Kurt directly. In front of me. Otherwise, he'll spend a month pretending I don't have authority. This afternoon, I said, after I walked the drainage line with Werner. She nodded. Then she turned back to the shelf and picked up her chalk. There are 43 sacks of winter rye, she said. Not 47. You should know that before you make any plans that depend on the grain supply. I'll adjust the numbers, I said. I already did. She pointed to the slate without looking at me. Updated column, right side. I looked. She had. I left her counting. Week 1. Werner walked the line on the first afternoon and made 3 corrections to my drawing. The channel needed to jog slightly west around a section of harder limestone that would have doubled the digging time. The collection pit needed to be larger to handle spring runoff, and one of the inspection points was positioned in a spot that would be underwater during heavy rain. All 3 corrections were right. I updated the drawing. Werner started the next morning with 8 men from Unnerfeld, all of them working off their tax obligation for 2 months in exchange for labor on the project. No gold out of the 40 we had. Shovels, pickaxes, a timber frame for the inspection covers, 15 gold for materials, delivered from the market town in 3 carts. 25 gold left. No room. The digging went faster than I'd planned. The soil in Unnerfeld was loose and cooperative for the first meter, which made Werner's men efficient. By the end of the first week, they had 2/3 of the main channel roughed in and were beginning to cut the stone lining from the quarry blocks, which a second crew had been clearing and splitting since Monday. Marta kept the count. Every day, men present, meters dug, stone used, materials remaining. She handed me the tally each evening without being asked. Week 2. The first section was complete. Channel cut, stone lined, covered near the well. We redirected the flow. The village watched. Not with enthusiasm. With the specific wariness of people who have seen improvements announced before and have learned to wait and see if they last past the first rain. 2 old women stood at the edge of the path with their arms crossed and watched the channel run clean for an hour before one of them said anything. Doesn't smell, she said. It won't, Werner said. It's moving. They went inside. They didn't say thank you. That was fine. Week 3. The crisis came from Hans Brauer. His house sat at the midpoint of the village, with a kitchen garden running along the south wall, cabbages, onions, some herbs his wife tended carefully. The drainage line, as drawn, passed directly through the eastern corner of that garden. 6 square meters of onions. He was waiting for us on the morning we came to mark the final section. No, he said. He was a large man, red-faced, holding a spade in a way that wasn't quite threatening, but wasn't casual either. Not through my garden. That's my family's food. Werner looked at me. I looked at the garden, then at the line we needed, then at the terrain on either side. The west side of the path had a stone foundation from an old storage shed. Going around it would mean cutting through 3 meters of near-solid rock. The east side, past the garden, had softer ground but added 4 meters to the run and put us uphill of the collection point, which would kill the gravity flow. The direct line was the only clean line. Hans, I said, your children, did they get sick last summer? He said nothing. I'm not asking to embarrass you. I'm asking because everyone's children got sick last summer. And the summer before. Because the well and the ditch are 8 meters apart and the ground between them is not as solid as it looks. He looked at the well, then at the ditch, then back at me. After the drainage is finished, I said, the well water will be clean. Not better, clean. The way it should have been for 20 years. Your children drink from that well. A long silence. My wife planted those onions in March, he said. I know. Go around the left side of the garden, I said to Werner. We add 4 meters to the run, but we drop the collection pit another 30 centimeters to keep the grade. Can you do that? Werner thought for 3 seconds. Yes. I looked at Hans. Your garden stays. The channel goes around. It costs us a day. Hans looked at his garden. At the channel markers. At the well. Go around the left, he said, and walked inside. It cost us a day and a half, not 1. But the channel went around. 6 weeks after we started, the drainage system was complete. 3 villages. 4 kilometers of stone-lined channel. 11 inspection points. 2 collection pits at the south end of each village, positioned downhill, covered, cleaned monthly by rotation. Marta had already drawn up the rotation schedule without being asked. Total cost, 15 gold for materials. Labor paid in tax exemption. Cash remaining, 25 gold. Marta's first quarterly report came 3 months later, in late summer. She put it on the table in front of me without comment. 2 pages of neat columns, the final line circled in red chalk. Summer mortality in the 3 drainage villages, for deaths. Previous year, 11. The year before, 9. That's the number, she said. I know what it means. I don't think you do, she said. Not unkindly. 4 of those 11 last year were children under 6. This year, 1. The other 3 deaths were an old man and 2 accidents. Nothing waterborne. I looked at the number for a moment. Keep tracking it, I said. Every quarter. This is going to matter later. She made a note. There's something else. She turned the page. Barenfeld came through last week while you were at the quarry. He stopped in Unterfeld. Apparently he'd heard about the drainage project. What did he say? He laughed. She said it flatly. He asked Lise whether the young master was spending his inheritance building toilets for peasants. Then he wrote on. Did Lise say anything back? She said you were feeling much better. Thank you for asking. I looked out the window. Barenfeld's estate was 12 kilometers south. I knew from the records that he'd had 2 bad summers in a row, that his peasant population was declining, that he'd borrowed against next year's harvest twice. Note the date of his visit, I said, and note that he has no drainage system. Marta looked at me. We'll want to remember that, I said, in about a year. She wrote it down. 3 projects, running at the same time. Different crews, different materials, different problems. Marta made a chart. 3 columns, 1 per project, updated every evening. Werner moved between all 3, which he complained about exactly once, and then stopped complaining when I pointed out that I was doing the same thing. This is what managing looks like, I didn't say. I just handed him the updated drawings and moved on. The quarry entrance took 4 days to clear. The collapsed beam turned out to be 3 beams, buried under 2 years of debris and 1 very determined blackberry thicket that Werner's crew attacked with the specific contempt of men who have been told something will take 4 days and want to be done in 3. They finished in 4. The blackberry won that argument. Inside, good stone. Better than I'd hoped. The previous foreman had left mid-cut on several faces, which meant the hardest work, finding the grain of the rock, starting the first split, was already done. Werner walked the interior for 20 minutes, tapping the walls with a small hammer, listening to the sound it made. 6 months of material here, he said. More if we're careful about waste. We'll be careful, I said. The quarry crew was 8 men, working the tax exemption arrangement. 3 days per week in the quarry in exchange for half their annual labor obligation forgiven. Marta calculated that this cost us less in lost field labor than the stone was worth, because the fields we needed to work were already understaffed. We weren't losing productive workers. We were giving idle ones something to do. Her numbers. I checked them. They were right. The first load of usable stone came out on day 6. Werner looked at it, sorted it by size with quick efficiency, and immediately redirected the largest pieces to a pile separate from the rest. Road base, he said. Yes. Kurt had been following me for 3 days with the expression of a man watching someone set fire to a perfectly good field. He finally spoke up when he saw where the first cartload of stone was going. You're paving the road, he said. With quarry stone. Not paving. Stabilizing. Crushed stone base. Drainage channels on both sides. Large stones at the edges to define the line. The surface stays dirt, but the structure underneath holds. That's the road through the main estate. That's 3 kilometers. 2.8. Young master. He stopped walking. Stone roads are for cities. For imperial highways. Merchants use dirt roads. They always have. I turned around. Kurt. Last autumn. How many merchants came through on the East Road? He thought. Perhaps 12 convoys in October. Before the rains. And after the rains? A pause. 2. Maybe 3. Because after the rains the road turns to mud and breaks axles. So the merchants who came in October and lost a wheel didn't come back in November. And they told their colleagues. I turned back toward the road. A merchant who gets through without breaking anything will come back. And he'll tell his colleagues that too. The stone doesn't cost us money. It costs us labor we already have. The road pays for itself the first winter. Kurt said nothing. The road work ran parallel to the quarry, split crew, Werner supervising the stone preparation. a younger man named George whom Werner had quietly identified as having actual spatial sense managing the laying crew. 3 weeks. 2.8 kilometers. Crushed stone base tamped firm, side drainage channels cut by hand, the surface graded and rolled with a log pulled by 2 horses. When it was done, it looked like a road. Not an imperial highway. Not dressed stone and perfect edges, but firm, level, draining correctly, the kind of surface a loaded cart could move over at a steady pace without the wheels sinking to the axle every 50 meters. The first merchant convoy that came through after the autumn rain stopped at the main house gate. The driver sat on his box and looked at the road behind him, then at the road ahead, then at me standing at the gate. "What happened to the road?" he said. "We fixed it." He looked behind him again. "My axle didn't break." "No." He thought about this. "I'll tell people," he said. "Please do," I said. Marta noted the date. She noted everything. The Bloomin' River ran fast and cold between 2 stone foundations that had been waiting 2 years for someone to finish what they started. I stood on the west bank with Werner for an hour on a clear morning, both of us looking at the foundations, the water between them, and the sketch I'd made of what needed to go across. The span was 31 meters. Not enormous. I'd seen longer, but longer than anything Werner had built. He told me this directly, which I appreciated. He didn't pretend. "I've done 12 meters," he said. 14 once, with a center pier. This needs no center pier. The river is too fast. Anything in the water will be undermined in 3 years. "Arch," I said. "Single span. The thrust goes into the foundations, not down. The foundations are already deep enough." I checked the original survey. They were built for exactly this. Werner looked at the foundations. At the water. At the sketch. "I've never built an arch that long. The principle is the same. Wider formwork, more voussoirs, longer keystone. The physics doesn't change with the scale." "How do you know this?" "I read," I said. Again. Werner made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, suppressed. "You say that a lot." "It keeps being the answer." He crouched at the bank and looked at the foundation on the near side, running his hand along the stone. Solid. No movement. No cracking at the waterline. No erosion undermining the base. "We'll need formwork across the whole span," he said. "Timber frame to hold the arch while the mortar cures. That's," he calculated, 40 meters of scaffolding over fast water. "I know. It's the hardest part. If the frame fails mid-cure, we lose the arch and the formwork." "Yes. And we don't have the money to rebuild." "No." He stood up, looked at the far bank, looked at the near bank. "I'll need 2 weeks to design the formwork," he said. "Properly. Not fast. Take the 2 weeks." The formwork took 3 weeks. Werner spent the first 2 drawing and redrawing, testing joints on a small model he built in his yard from scrap timber, loading the model with stones to find where it wanted to fail. He found 2 failure points, redesigned them, tested again. Only then did he order the timber cut. The Eisenstadt letter arrived during week 2. It came through the official post. Wax seal, formal language, the specific tone of a man who has decided to remind you of something you'd prefer to forget. The second bank of the river, it said, fell within the disputed boundary zone between Blumenthal and Eisenstadt holdings. Construction of any permanent structure in that zone without the Count's approval was a violation of the boundary agreement of, and here followed a reference to a document I didn't have. I went to Father's archive. The archive was 3 wooden chests in the back of the steward's office, full of documents going back 60 years, none of them organized. Marta and I spent 2 evenings going through them. She sorted, I read. On the second evening, in the bottom of the 3rd chest under a stack of grain receipts from a decade ago, I found the Imperial Roads Act of 1247. I read it twice. Then I read the relevant section a 3rd time. Any bridge or road constructed on disputed land, connecting 2 established trade routes, and completed at private expense, shall remain under the jurisdiction of the constructing party for a period not less than the cost of construction divided by the annual toll revenue. Said period to be registered with the Imperial Surveyor and binding upon all parties regardless of territorial claims. I showed it to Marta. She read it. Then she looked at me. "He doesn't know this exists. His lawyers might. His lawyers didn't find it. We found it." She set the document down. "Register it before you finish the bridge." I sent a rider to the Imperial Surveyor's office the next morning with a certified copy and the registration fee, 3 gold, which hurt, but less than losing the bridge. Eisenstadt's lawyer arrived 2 weeks after the bridge was complete. He was a small man in expensive clothes who had clearly not been told what he was riding into. He came with a formal demand letter and the confident posture of someone accustomed to watching people fold when legal language appeared. Marta met him at the gate. She was holding a folder. He presented his letter. She presented the registration document, the Imperial Act, and a surveyor's certification dated 6 days before the bridge was finished. He read through it. Read it again. This, he said finally, is a very old document. Yes, Marta said. It is. Imperial law from 1247. Still binding. She tilted her head. Is there anything else? He left without staying for the meal she'd offered. She came to find me afterward. Her expression was the controlled version of something much more satisfied. He took a copy of the registration, she said. He'll go back and tell Eisenstadt it's solid. Good. I want Eisenstadt to know exactly where he stands. The toll income started the first week. 3 gold for a heavy wagon, 1 for a light cart. The Salzmers road had been waiting 2 years for this crossing. The first month, 28 gold. The second, 31. Marta put the numbers in the ledger and circled them. Stable. Recurring. Requiring nothing further from us except a man at the gate to collect. The east fields were dying slowly and expensively. A third of the main field, 20 hectares of decent soil sitting above the river's reach, was producing half what it should. In a wet year it came back somewhat. In a dry year it failed almost completely. Every farmer on that half of the field knew it. They planted it anyway because they had no choice. The river was 400 meters west. The elevation difference between the riverbank and the east field was 3 meters over that distance. A gentle, even slope that was almost perfectly suited for gravity-fed irrigation. You couldn't have designed the terrain better if you tried. I walked the line with Werner on a Tuesday morning. He brought a simple leveling instrument, a wooden frame with a plumb line, and we stopped every 20 meters, drove a stake, took a reading. The slope was consistent. No surprises. Main channel runs east along the south property line, I said. Then 3 branches north, each with a wooden sluice gate. Full flow in dry months, partial flow in wet months, closed in winter. Sluice gates, Werner said. I've made those. Not complicated. I know. That's why you're doing them instead of me. He almost smiled. Werner almost smiled, maybe twice in the 6 weeks I'd known him. I was counting. The channel banks, he said. Stone-lined like the drainage, or earthwork. Earthwork on the main channel. It's wider, lower pressure, easier to repair if it shifts. Stone on the branch channels where the flow is faster. We can't afford to have a branch undercut and collapse in the middle of a dry July. Agreed. He made a note on his slate. 6 weeks. 5 if the second crew helps. 5.5. He said. The second crew digs straight. These need to follow the grade. 5.5, I agreed. The complication arrived in week 2, from the west. Baron Klein's estate began on the other side of a low ridge 3 kilometers from the river. His fields were higher, drier, and his farmers were even worse off than mine had been before the drainage. He'd been watching the construction from a distance through an agent. I knew this because Marta had noted the agent stopping at Unnerfeld twice, asking questions, buying nothing. Then Klein sent 3 men to block the construction site. They arrived on a Wednesday morning and positioned themselves across the main channel line, not speaking, just standing. Large men, armed, but not threateningly, swords sheathed, hands visible, the posture of men who were there to make a point rather than start a fight. The crew stopped digging and looked at me. I looked at the 3 men for a moment. Then I sent for Marta. She arrived 20 minutes later, having clearly been told what was happening on the way, because she arrived with her ledger already open. Tell me what it would cost to extend the irrigation system to Klein's west fields. I said quietly. She looked at the terrain, looked at her notes, calculated for 90 seconds. 1 additional branch channel, about 600 meters. 1 more sluice gate. Call it 3 weeks of extra work. And what would his yield increase be worth to him? His fields are worse than ours were. If the improvement matches, 70, 80 gold per year. Good. I walked over to Klein's men. I need to send a message to your lord. I have a business proposal. They blinked. That was not what they'd expected me to say. The message went that afternoon. 2 days later, Klein's steward arrived. Not Klein himself, which told me that Klein was interested but didn't want to be seen being interested. We sat in the main hall with Marta present, ledger open, and I laid out the proposal. We extend the irrigation system to cover Klein's west fields. One additional channel, one gate, tied to our main system. His fields get the same water access as ours. In exchange, 200 gold, paid in advance, for the construction and a 10-year maintenance agreement. The steward said his lord would consider 200 too high. I said I understood, and that the offer was open for 1 week, after which we would complete our system, close the intake, and any future extension would require starting from the river again at full cost. He came back in 3 days. Klein would pay 120 gold. I accepted. Marta looked at me after the steward left. You would have taken 100. Yes. He would have gone to 80. I know. But he didn't, which means he was already convinced at 120 and was negotiating out of habit. I looked at the ledger. 120 gold for 3 weeks of labor and 1 sluice gate. What does that cost us in materials? She calculated. 11 gold. So we sold the extension for 109 gold of pure margin. Yes. She wrote the number down. I'll note that we sold him a technology that cost us only labor and stone. Note that in the margin, I said. Underline it. I want to remember that pattern. The 3 men from Klein's estate went home the same afternoon the steward arrived. I never mentioned them. Klein never mentioned them. We were in business. The full irrigation system, our fields plus the Klein extension, was complete in 6 weeks. The first controlled watering of the east fields happened on a dry Thursday in late summer. Werner opened the main sluice gate himself. The water came through the channel, split at the first junction, ran down both branches, and spread across the dry soil in a slow, even sheet. The farmers stood at the edges and watched it. One of them, an old man named Friedrich who had been farming that east section for 30 years, crouched down and put his hand in the water where it was soaking into the cracked earth. He stayed crouched for a long time. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Werner closed the gate after 20 minutes. Enough for the first soaking, too much would compact the soil before it could absorb properly. He made a note on his slate about the flow rate and the time. Next week, he said to Friedrich. Same time, same duration. Then we assess. Friedrich stood up. He looked at the channel, at the gate, at the network of ditches spreading across his field. 30 years, he said. Nobody thought to do this in 30 years. The river didn't move, I said. The idea just took a while. He walked back to his field and picked up his hoe. The debt problem solved itself in a way I hadn't expected. When I presented the revised numbers to Eisenstadt's representative, bridge income 30 gold per month, irrigation recovery estimated at 90 gold per year, Klein payment already received, the man didn't argue. He recalculated. Then he sent a message back to his employer that took 4 days to get a response. The response was not forgiveness. It was a restructured repayment schedule, 800 gold per year over 5 years, with the bridge toll receipts as collateral. Marta looked at the terms. He's angry, she said. These are punitive interest rates. Yes, but he's accepting them, which means he's decided we're good for it. I signed the agreement. That's worth more than better terms. We had 90 days of breathing room behind us. Now we had 5 years. The next problem was simpler to state and harder to solve. We didn't have enough people. The irrigation was working. The fields were producing. The road was carrying traffic. The bridge was generating income. But 3 of our 5 villages were still half empty. The quarry was running at a third of its potential capacity because we didn't have the hands to run it faster, and the construction projects that needed to come next, the mill, the permanent market stalls near the bridge, the expansion of the grain storage, were all waiting on bodies. 80 people could not build what I had in mind. We needed 200, then 400. I wrote the announcement myself. It took 3 drafts. The first was too long. The second was too formal. It sounded like an imperial decree rather than an offer. The third was the one I sent. Blumenthal Estate. Open settlement stone houses at the price of wooden ones. Free schooling for all children under 14. Drainage. Clean water. Sealed wells. First 100 families. 1 full year without rent. After the first year, fixed rent, written contract, no arbitrary increases. Bring your family. Bring your tools. Bring anyone who wants to work. It went to the market squares of 3 towns within 40 kilometers. Marta hired 2 men to read it aloud twice daily for 2 weeks, because most of the people we wanted couldn't read. The reactions came back through the same men. From the lords, laughter mostly. The boy builder is giving away houses. One of Klein's neighbors sent a message asking if I was ill again. Eisenstadt, according to Marta's informant in his household, said nothing, which meant he was thinking, which meant he understood more than the others. From the peasants, interest. Careful, cautious, heavily qualified interest, filtered through layers of suspicion accumulated over generations of being promised things that didn't arrive. They asked questions. Is the water actually clean? Are the contracts actually written? What happens if the harvest fails? Marta compiled the questions, and I answered each one in a second document that went out the following week. Yes, the drainage exists. Come and see it. Yes, written contracts. Here is the form. If the harvest fails, we negotiate. You don't starve because of weather. The first family arrived 3 weeks after the announcement. They came from 20 kilometers east. A farmer named Tobias, his wife, 3 children, and a cart containing everything they owned, which wasn't much. They had been tenants on a minor lord's estate where the rent had increased twice in 2 years, and the well had run dry in August. Marta met them at the road. She showed them the village, the drainage channels, the well. She showed them the contract. Tobias read it slowly, his lips moving. His wife read it after him. They looked at each other. It says fixed, Tobias said. The rent can't go up without 60 days' notice and a written reason. That's correct, Marta said. Our last lord raised it with a verbal message from his steward. That won't happen here. They signed. By the end of the first month, 11 families. By the end of the second, 31. Word was moving faster than the announcement itself. People who had visited telling people who hadn't, the specific transmission network of market days and churchyards and travelers stopping at inns. Then Klein's people started arriving. The first group from Klein's estate was 7 families, arriving together on a Tuesday morning with their carts and their children and the specific posture of people who have made a decision and are not going back. I recognized the situation immediately. Klein's tenants were not free to leave without settling their debts, standard feudal contract, same as everywhere. If they were here, either their debts were small enough that they'd paid them off themselves, or they hadn't, and they were hoping distance would solve the problem. I asked Tobias, who had become something of an informal spokesperson for the new arrivals. He told me honestly, 3 of the 7 families had outstanding obligations to Klein. Small amounts, accumulated rent arrears from the bad harvests, the kind of debt that never quite got paid off because the next season was always slightly worse than the one before. Total outstanding, 62 gold. I paid it. Not because it was cheap, 62 gold was 2 months of bridge income and it hurt, but because what I was buying was worth more than 62 gold. I was buying the signal. Every family that arrived from Klein's estate and found their debt already cleared was going to tell 12 other families. The message wasn't Blumenthal has money. The message was Blumenthal means what it says. Klein arrived personally 4 days later. He came with 6 men and the expression of someone who had been building toward anger for a week and had arrived at the fully constructed version. He didn't dismount at the gate. He spoke from horseback, which was meant to establish something. You've been poaching my tenants, he said. I've been accepting applications, I said. Your tenants applied. 3 of them were in debt to my estate. I said. That debt has been settled. Certified copies of the receipts are available if you need them for your records. He stared at me. You bought them out. I settled the debt. They're free to be wherever they choose. I reached into my coat and took out the document Marta had prepared 2 days ago, when I decided this conversation was coming. Imperial Settlement Act of 1231. Any serf or tenant whose outstanding obligations have been discharged by a third party becomes a free tenant of that third party's choosing, provided the original lord receives full settlement of all documented debts. I held it out toward him. I have the receipts. Shall I have copies sent to your estate, or would you prefer to take them now? Klein's jaw was doing something complicated. You planned this, he said. I made an offer and honored it. What you do with that information is your business. He looked at his men, at the families visible in the background of the yard, going about their mourning. At me. The irrigation water, he said. Our agreement is in full effect. Your fields are receiving water. The sluice schedule is posted at the junction gate, as agreed. Nothing about our business arrangement has changed. I put the document back in my coat. Unless you'd like it to change. He didn't answer that. He looked at me for a long moment with the expression of a man reassessing something. Then he turned his horse and left. Marta appeared at my shoulder approximately 4 seconds after his party was out of the gate. She had clearly been watching from the side window of the hall. He'll stop paying for the irrigation, she said. In about a week, I agreed. When the anger is still hot. And then, we close his sluice gate. He waits 1 dry month, counts what it costs him, and reopens the conversation on worse terms for himself than the original agreement. She looked at the road where Klein had gone. Or he decides he hates you more than he values his harvest. Possible, I said. But I don't think Klein is that irrational. He's petty, not stupid. I turned back toward the hall. Note the date. Note the amount we paid. Note that he came personally and left without making a legal claim. She was already writing. Marta found him. She came to me on a Friday afternoon with the specific expression she used when she had solved a problem I hadn't asked her to solve yet. There's a man in the Middleback Tavern, she said. He's been there for 3 weeks. He's teaching the tavern keeper's children to read in exchange for his room and meals. I looked up from the ledger. Teaching them what? Reading. Writing. Some arithmetic. He does it in the mornings, apparently. The tavern keeper's wife mentioned it to Elsa in Unterfeld, who mentioned it to me. She paused. He used to be a schoolmaster in Salzhaven. He lost the position 2 years ago. Why? He drinks. I put down my pen. Bring him tomorrow. He arrived the next morning looking like a man who had been warned to be presentable and had made a genuine effort, which meant he was clean but not entirely steady. August Kellner, 43 years old, thin in the way of someone who has been spending money on wine instead of food, with the hands of a man who had spent decades holding chalk and books rather than tools or plows. Intelligent eyes, slightly unfocused. He sat across from me and didn't apologize for anything, which I respected. Marta tells me you've been teaching, I said. I teach. It's what I do. He said it without particular pride or defensiveness. The children learn quickly when someone bothers to teach them properly. How many have you had? 4 in the tavern. Before that, 60 in Salzhaven. Why did you leave Salzhaven? He looked at the table. The school board decided they preferred a schoolmaster who was less likely to fall asleep at the council meetings. Were they wrong? A pause. No. I leaned back. Here's what I need. In 10 years, I will need people who can read survey drawings, manage accounts, write contracts, oversee construction, run supply chains. Those people don't exist yet. They need to be made. The children in these villages are the material. You're the process. He looked at me with slightly more focus than before. You want a school, he said. I want a factory that produces competent adults. A school is the first stage. That's a bleak way to describe education. It's an accurate one. The bleak part and the worthwhile part aren't mutually exclusive. He was quiet for a moment. Salzhaven had 40 children and 3 rooms. What do you have? Currently, 2 rooms in the East Village Hall that aren't being used for anything. 112 children between the ages of 5 and 14 in the 3 main villages, with more arriving monthly. No teaching materials, no slates, no books. That's nothing, he said. That's less than nothing. Yes. Which means you can design it correctly from the beginning instead of fixing someone else's mistakes. He looked at his hands. At the table. Out the window at the yard where 2 of the recently arrived children were chasing a chicken with the absolute commitment of people with nothing better to do. Lodging, he said. Food. And 1 gold per month, I said. Paid on the 1st. In coin. He looked at me. That's city wages. City wages for city work. The position requires someone who knows what they're doing. I paused. The drinking is your own matter. It affects the children's education. It becomes my matter. Clear. He considered this for a long time. Long enough that I wasn't certain which way it was going. When do I start? He said. Monday, I said. Marta will show you the rooms. He stood, nodded once in the way of a man who had more to say and had decided not to say it yet, and left. Marta appeared in the doorway. He'll be good, she said. Probably, I agreed. Watch the drinking for the 1st month. Don't interfere unless it's affecting the work. Already planned, she said, and went back to her ledger. By the time the settlement reached 160 families, we had a problem that Marta had been tracking quietly for 6 weeks before she brought it to me. Food, she said. She put the ledger on the table, open to a page of columns. We are currently producing 60% of what the estate needs. When the next wave of families arrives, and they will, the announcement is still circulating. We go below 50. I looked at the numbers. 310 people. Fields producing 60%. The gap was covered currently by purchases from the market, which cost money we preferred to keep. What do we have that we're not using? I said. The South Marsh, partially drained. The low meadows east of Niederbach. The mill pond. I thought about it. Poultry first. Chickens, geese, low cost to establish, fast return, eggs before meat. Then dairy cattle, then pigs. The marsh pond for fish. The marsh pond isn't clean enough yet. It will be. Werner has the drainage extension on the schedule for next month. I looked at the numbers again. What does the livestock cost us to establish? Realistic number. She had already calculated it. Of course she had. 300 gold for a reasonable starting stock. Breeding pairs, not market animals. Built to grow the herd, not slaughter it immediately. We have 140 gold. Yes. So we need a partner. I thought for a moment. Dietrich. Dietrich was the merchant who had been using the bridge road most consistently. A middle-aged man from Salzhaven with a trading operation that ran between 3 market towns and who had, over the past 4 months, developed the habit of stopping at the main house when he passed through. He was smart, reliable, and had been watching the estate's development with the specific attention of someone calculating when to ask about investment opportunities. I sent him a message that afternoon. He arrived 2 days later and sat across from me with his hands folded and the expression of a man who had already decided yes and was waiting to hear the terms. 300 gold into breeding stock, I said. Chickens, geese, dairy cattle, pigs, fish breeding pairs for the South Pond. You own 40% of the farm's output for 18 months. After 18 months, the arrangement ends and you receive a final settlement of your share at market price. He unfolded his hands. Folded them differently. 40% for 18 months on 300 gold. The farm needs to produce 750 gold in 18 months for me to break even. At current food prices and our projected herd growth, you'll see 900. Marta has the projection if you want to see it. He looked at Marta, who was sitting at the side table with the ledger open. She turned it toward him without being asked. He read it. He was a fast reader. 35%, he said. 18 months. I looked at Marta. She gave me a fractional nod. We'd agreed beforehand that 35 was acceptable. 35%, 18 months, I said. And you have first right of purchase on our surplus production at market rate after the arrangement ends. That last part he hadn't expected. He looked up from the ledger. First right of purchase on surplus, he said slowly. You'll have a reliable supply. We'll have a reliable buyer. Simpler for both of us. He thought about it for exactly as long as it took him to understand that this was a better deal than the 35% alone. Agreed, he said. The breeding stock arrived over 3 weeks in carts. 40 laying hens, 12 geese, 6 dairy cows, 8 pigs, and 200 fish fingerlings for the South Pond once Werner's drainage extension was done. Marta assigned a family from the new arrivals, the Howers, who had kept animals on their previous estate, to manage the poultry. An older man named Peter, who'd been a dairyman for 20 years, took the cattle. 6 months later, the estate was fully food self-sufficient. 8 months later, we had surplus. The surplus went to Dietrich at market rate, as agreed. Marta calculated his return, 940 gold over the 18 months, on his 300 gold investment. He came to collect the final settlement himself. He sat in the hall and looked at the number Marta put in front of him. 328% return, he said. 18 months, I said. Not bad. He looked at me with the expression of a man updating his assessment of something. What are you building next? Several things, I said. I'll send word when I need another partner. He nodded, finished his tea, left. Marta watched him go. He'll come back. Yes, I said. He will. Werner found it on a Tuesday, which was the kind of day things like this happen. Ordinary, unremarkable, a day you wouldn't have remembered otherwise. He came to the main house in the late afternoon with his coat dusty and a small piece of rock in his left hand. He put it on the desk in front of me without preamble. Quartz, white-gray, irregular, the size of a large fist, and running through it in thin branching lines, catching the lamplight, yellow. I looked at it for a moment. Where? New face in the north section. We opened it last week. He sat down across from me, which he rarely did. Werner preferred to stand. It runs into the wall. I don't know how deep. How wide is the vein at the face? 8 centimeters. Possibly more once we clear the surrounding rock. He paused. It's not rich, but it's consistent. No gaps in what I can see. I picked up the piece of quartz and turned it in the light. The gold content was low. This was not a nugget situation, not the kind of discovery that produced immediate wealth. This was the kind of discovery that produced wealth if you had the right equipment to extract it efficiently and the patience to run it for years. I know what this needs, I said. Werner looked at me. Tell me. I explained the stamp mill, the principle of it. The water wheel driving a set of heavy iron heads that rose and fell continuously, crushing the ore to powder. The powder washed over plates to separate the gold by density. I drew it on paper while I talked, the way I always explained things to Werner, drawing first, words second. He studied the drawing for 3 minutes. The water wheel we can build, he said. We've done 2 already. Yes, the stamp heads need to be iron. Cast, not forged. They need mass, not strength. Brant can do that. He's still here. The frame needs to handle continuous impact without shaking itself apart. That's the hard part. Cross-bracing, Werner said, pointing to the drawing. Here and here. And the pivot points for the cam need to be replaceable. They'll wear. I looked at where he was pointing. He was right on both counts. How long to build it? I said. 6 weeks for the structure. Another 2 to calibrate the cam timing so the heads don't all strike at once. That would shake the frame apart in a month. 8 weeks total. If nothing goes wrong. Something always went wrong. We both knew this. The stamp mill cost 200 gold to build. Iron from Dietrich's supply network. Timber from the estate. Werner's crew for 10 weeks, including the 2 extra it actually took. It came online in late spring and immediately produced less than expected while Werner adjusted the cam timing, then settled into a rhythm that Marta calculated at 60 gold per month in refined output after materials and labor. Not a windfall. A machine. Steady, reliable, running on water and gravity, producing value while we slept. Marta put the number in the income column and drew a line under it. This changes the debt calculation, she said. Yes, and it changes something else. I looked at the map on the wall. We can afford to think about the sea now. Face slap number 4 came 3 weeks after the mill started running. Eisenstadt's formal letter arrived on a Friday, written in the careful language of a man who has had his lawyer draft something designed to sound reasonable while demanding something unreasonable. The imperial mining statutes, the letter said, granted the territorial lord rights over subsurface resources on contested lands. The north section of the quarry, where the vein had been found, fell within the boundary zone Eisenstadt had been disputing since the bridge construction. I went to Father's archive again, 40 minutes this time, because I knew roughly where to look. The Blumenthal estate charter was in the second chest, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it dry for 200 years. I found the relevant clause in the second paragraph. All subsurface rights, mineral and otherwise, within the boundaries herein described, are granted in perpetuity to the Blumenthal family and their heirs, said grants superseding any subsequent territorial claims or imperial statutes of lesser antiquity. The charter was dated 1189. The imperial mining statute Eisenstadt was citing was from 1334, 145 years older. Entirely unambiguous. I sent Marta to deliver the response personally, with a certified copy of the charter attached. She came back the same afternoon. He had 3 lawyers there, she said. They read it. One of them left the room. The other 2 argued with each other for a few minutes. She sat down. Then his steward told me the count would need time to review the document. He'll need a lot of time, I said. It's 200 years old and entirely clear. Yes. She paused. He laughed, by the way, when he first saw me coming with papers instead of a lawyer. He said, I'm quoting, the boy sends a girl with documents. She opened her ledger. I told him the documents were the relevant part. Then I gave him the charter. She made a note. I watched her write. Note that he laughed. I said, already done, she said. Date, time, exact words. The port problem had been in the back of my calculations since the bridge. Overland trade was good. 30 gold per month, growing. But overland trade had a ceiling, road conditions, cart capacity, seasonal mud. Maritime trade had a different ceiling entirely. A single ship carried what 50 carts carried, faster and cheaper per unit of cargo. The nearest port was at Reinhardt's estate, 12 kilometers south. Baron Reinhardt was not an enemy, not a friend either. A man who had positioned himself carefully between competing interests and had remained useful to everyone and obligated to no one. He had a working harbor, a small trading fleet, and a relationship with Eisenstadt that was economic rather than political. Eisenstadt bought passage for his exports. Reinhardt collected the fee. I rode to see him personally. He received me in a hall that was comfortable without being impressive. The hall of a man who had decided enough was sufficient. He was in his 50s, gray at the temples, with the careful eyes of someone who has spent decades watching people try to use him. Karl Blumenthal, he said. No young, no boy. I noted it. I should have come sooner, I said. I was occupied. So I heard. He gestured to a chair. The bridge. The drainage. The guns, apparently. 8. 9 next week. Yes. A pause. What do you want? Passage rights through your port for Blumenthal cargo. Fixed fee per ship, negotiated rate, long-term agreement. You profit from every ton we move, without any capital expenditure. He had already calculated this before I arrived. I could tell by how quickly he answered. 15% of declared cargo value, he said. 10%, with a minimum monthly guarantee of 20 gold regardless of traffic. The minimum guarantee was the interesting part. It made his income stable even when our shipping was low, which reduced his risk. He understood this immediately. 10%, minimum 20, he said. I handle harbor fees and loading coordination. Agreed. 20 minutes. The fastest significant negotiation I'd had. Reinhardt was efficient because he'd decided before I arrived. Then he said, there's something you should know. I waited. Eisenstadt came to see me last month. He's building something, talking to Klein and 2 minor barons to the north. Formal meetings, not social ones. He paused. He's angry. Not personally. Professionally. You've made him look incompetent in front of his peers 3 times in 2 years. Men like Eisenstadt don't absorb that quietly. Why are you telling me this? Because I've just agreed to a commercial arrangement with you, which means your instability is my problem. He picked up his wine. And because I'm curious whether you already knew. I suspected. I didn't have confirmation. Now you do. He drank. Whatever he's planning, spring at the earliest. Roads. I rode back and went directly to Marta. Start the intelligence network, I said. Eisenstadt is organizing. I want to know who, what, and when. She had already opened a new section in her ledger. I started 3 weeks ago, she said, when Reinhardt's harbor master mentioned unusual cargo movements to one of our bridge merchants. She turned the ledger toward me. Eisenstadt has been purchasing provisions in bulk. Dried meat, grain, medical supplies. The kind of purchasing you do before you move a large number of men. I looked at the entries. Dates, quantities, sources, estimated troop count. 600 to 800 men. How long have you been tracking this? 3 weeks. I was waiting until I had enough to show you. I looked at her. Next time, I said, show me when you start, not when you finish. She made a note. Understood. The first Blumenthal ship left Reinhardt's port 6 weeks after the agreement was signed. It carried grain surplus, cloth from a small weaving operation August's older students had started as a practical mathematics exercise, and 3 crates of refined gold from the stamp mill. Marta had organized the cargo manifest herself, itemized and declared at accurate value. She had decided, without being told, that undervaluing cargo to reduce Reinhardt's 10% was the kind of saving that cost more than it saved in the long run. I agreed with her when she told me. I hadn't thought of it first. The ship returned in 12 days. Marta calculated the net return after Reinhardt's fee and ship costs, 40 gold, first month. She put it in the ledger next to the bridge income and the stamp mill output. Bridge, 30 per month. Stamp mill, 60 per month. Maritime, month 1, 40 per month. Combined passive income, I said. 130 gold per month, she said. Not counting farm surplus and quarry contracts, which are variable. I wrote the number down. Then underneath it I wrote the other number. Eisenstadt's estimated force from Marta's intelligence entries. 600 to 800 men, spring approach. Our standing fighters. 200 trained, 300 capable adults with no military experience. 8 guns with the budget not yet allocated. The stamp mill was running. The mine was producing. The sea route was open. And we had one winter to build something that 800 men couldn't walk through. Marta, I said. Yes. What does it cost to cast 8 bronze artillery pieces? She looked at me. This was not a question she had prepared for. That was rare enough that I noticed it. I don't know yet, she said. Find out, I said. By tomorrow. She found out by that evening. The alliance was signed in October. Marta had already known for 2 weeks. Her network, built quietly through the summer, starting from Reinhardt's tip about bulk provisions purchasing, had expanded by autumn to include a laundry woman in Eisenstadt's household, passing information through a cloth merchant who crossed our bridge twice a month. The formal document confirming the alliance arrived from that source on a Tuesday. For estates, a sealed agreement, the stated purpose, mutual defense against unlawful expansion and the protection of traditional rights. Traditional rights. I read that twice. They mean the right to keep their peasants poor and sick, Marta said. Yes, dressed up as principal. I folded the letter. Reinhardt's estimate was spring. Does your network confirm that? Yes. The roads are bad in winter. They won't move large numbers of men until March at the earliest. The provisions purchasing matches a spring timeline. The quantities are right for 60 to 90 days of campaigning. For months. Maybe 5. Not enough time to match their numbers. More than enough time to make numbers irrelevant. August's first graduating class was not yet old enough to fight. But the best of them, the 16 and 17-year-olds who had been in the school for 2 years, who could read maps and write reports and calculate distances, were exactly old enough to ride horses and ask questions in market towns without attracting attention. Marta's network gave us the broad picture, force sizes, provisions, timing. What it couldn't give us was route detail. Hashtag Visovichenka, her informants were in households and harbor offices and market stalls. They could count wagons. They couldn't get close to officers' conversations and in yards. For that I needed different people. I spoke to August directly. He sat across from me with his hands around a cup of tea and the expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation and had prepared his objections. They're children, he said. The youngest is 16. The oldest is 18. They're my students. They're also the best trained observers within 40 kilometers. I need people who can count wagons, identify unit sizes, read insignia, and write a coherent report afterward. Your students can do all of those things. Most soldiers can't do half. He looked at his tea. If something happens to them, they're not going near anything dangerous. Market towns, road junctions, in yards, counting and watching. I paused. August, if we lose this war, what happens to the school? A long silence. How many do you need? He said. 6. Volunteers only. I'll speak to them myself. 7 volunteered. I took 6, sent them out in pairs to 3 different towns with written instructions, a cover story about being merchants' apprentices doing a supply survey, and a list of specific things to observe and record. They came back in 2 weeks with what Marta's network couldn't reach. 4 estates confirmed. Combined force approximately 800 men, 500 trained fighters, the rest armed servants and conscripted farmers. Eisenstadt commanded the largest contingent, around 400. Klein had rebuilt his relationship with 2 minor barons after our irrigation dispute and was contributing 150. The other 2 estates split the remainder. Their approach plan, pieced together from overheard conversations in 2 separate inns, coordinated movement from 3 directions, east, west, and north. Leave the south open. They expected us to run toward Reinhardt's port. They didn't know we had an agreement with Reinhardt. Marta combined her network's data with the students' field reports and built the complete picture on paper. For columns on a map, arrows showing projected routes, estimated timelines based on road conditions, and troop movement speeds. They think we'll break, she said. Everyone thinks that until they don't. I said, show Werner the map. I want his opinion on the eastern approach. Werner looked at the map for 5 minutes without speaking. Then he pointed to a section of the eastern road where it passed through a natural low point between 2 rises. Here, he said. This is where I'd stop an army. Yes, I said. Me too. Werner's objection to fortifying the entire estate perimeter was practical, not architectural. We don't have enough men to defend a perimeter that large, he said. Walls without defenders are just obstacles. They slow people down, they don't stop them. I don't want to stop them on the perimeter. I said. I want to slow them down at the entry points, funnel them into specific approaches, and make each approach a problem they have to solve under pressure. He looked at the map, at the 3 main roads into the estate, at the terrain on either side of each. Redoubts, he said. Not walls. 3 defensive positions, 1 on each approach. Stone and earthwork, elevated, covering the road. Yes, plus a trench line across the eastern field, here. I pointed. Not to stop them, to make them choose between the trench and the road. If they choose the road, they're in the Redoubt's field of fire. If they choose the field, they're somewhere else, I said. Which is also fine. Werner studied the map for another minute. The Eastern Redoubt is the most important. Eisenstadt's main force comes that way. I know. Build it first. Best stone, deepest foundation. It needs to hold against a serious push. 6 weeks for the eastern one. For each for the west and north. I'll need the quarry running at full capacity. It will be. He started the next morning. The redoubts went up through November and into December, Werner's crews working in the cold with the specific focused energy of people who understood what they were building and why. The Eastern Redoubt was a serious piece of construction. 3 meters of stone and packed earth, an elevated fighting platform on the inner face, a deep ditch on the outer approach filled with sharpened stakes, and a covered position for 6 men with a clear line of sight down 400 meters of road. The western one was smaller but positioned at a road junction where 2 approaches converged, which made it cover more ground with fewer defenders. The northern redoubt Werner built into the side of a hill, using the natural terrain as the rear wall. He was quietly proud of this one. He showed it to me when it was half finished, and I could see why. It was elegant in the specific way that good engineering is elegant, every element doing 2 jobs at once. If I'd had this 40 years ago, he said, I'd have built everything differently. You'll build more? I said. He looked at me sideways. You're planning more wars? I'm planning not to need more wars. These are different things. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. The sulfur smell from the South Marsh had been in Marta's records since the 2nd month of the drainage project. She'd noted it as a nuisance, a reason the collection pits needed extra ventilation, without understanding what it meant. I understood what it meant. I went to the marsh on a November morning and spent 2 hours at the edge of the drainage outlet, looking at the mineral deposits on the stones where the water ran slow. Yellow-white crystalline residue, exactly where it should be. Not pure, not concentrated, but present. Enough to work with. The other components were simpler. Charcoal from the kiln that Werner's crews used for metal work. Potassium nitrate was the difficult one. It required time and a specific process. I set up the production quietly, in the back section of the South Farm complex, managed by 2 men I'd selected for their ability to follow precise instructions without asking too many questions. Compost pits, organic matter, wood ash, regular turning, covered against rain. Potassium nitrate crystallizes from the mixture over 4 to 6 months if the conditions are right. We started in October. By February, we would have enough. I told Werner in December. We were sitting in his workshop, late evening, the drawings for the gun design spread on the table between us. He'd been looking at them for 20 minutes. The design was simple, deliberately so. Cast bronze barrel, fixed rear, touch hole at the top, mounted on a wooden frame with 2 wheels and an adjustable elevation screw. I've cast bronze, he said. For bells. For decorative work. The principle is the same. The tolerances are tighter. How much tighter? The bore needs to be consistent within 2 millimeters across the full length. If it's not, the pressure escapes unevenly and the ball goes sideways. He looked at the cross-section drawing. I can hold 2 millimeters. I'll need to make a boring tool. I know. I drew it. I turned to the 2nd page. A long iron rod with a cutting head, designed to be turned by hand through the cooled casting. He studied it. This will take time. We have until March. Realistically, February for the first one so we can test and correct. How many do you need? 8 operational by the time they move. He looked up from the drawings. 8. You want me to cast 8 bronze artillery pieces in 3 months? Yes. A long pause. I'll need to hire a 2nd bronze caster. Someone who knows the work. Find him. Whatever he costs. Werner nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he decided something was difficult and was going to do it anyway. One question, he said. Yes. This powder. You're certain it works? It works, I said. The question is whether our casting is precise enough to use it safely. That's why we test the first one before we build the other 7. He looked at the drawing for another moment. Then he rolled it carefully and tied it with a cord. February, he said. First one finished. The stamp mill was producing 60 gold per month from the gold vein. Every coin of it went to the war preparation. The accounting was straightforward and brutal. Bronze for 8 barrels, 180 gold, sourced through Dietrich, shipped by sea to the port and overland from there. Sulfur processing, charcoal, nitrate production equipment, 40 gold. Timber for 8 gun carriages and the boring tools. Werner's labor, no material cost. Total direct expenditure, 220 gold. Cash remaining after payment, 35 gold. No reserve. If something went wrong, a bad harvest, a broken mill wheel, an unexpected legal cost, we had 35 gold to handle it. That was the number I lived with through January and February while Werner's crew worked. The first barrel was finished on the 14th of February. We took it to the east field on a cold morning. Werner, myself, George, and 2 of Werner's most experienced men. The barrel was mounted on a temporary timber frame, not the final carriage, elevated at a 20-degree angle toward a wooden target wall we'd built 200 meters away. A thick oak plank, 3 centimeters, set upright in a frame. I measured the charge myself. 80 grams of powder, wrapped in paper, pushed to the base with a wooden rod. Iron ball seated on top, fitting snugly. The bore consistency was good. Werner had held his tolerances. Werner touched the linstock to the touch hole. The barrel split. Not explosively. A clean fracture along a casting seam that ran from the touch hole down the left side of the breech. The 2 halves separating in a single sharp crack that sent Werner and his men back 2 steps. No one was injured except Werner. A fragment of bronze the size of a finger caught him in the right shoulder. Not deep. He pulled it out himself, pressed a cloth against it, and stood looking at the broken barrel with his left hand. Nobody said anything for a moment. Seam thickness, he said finally. My error. I thinned the wall at the touch hole to make the boring easier. That's where the stress concentrates. Yes. He looked at the 2 halves on the ground. At his shoulder. At me. 2 days, he said. I'll redesign the mold. I looked at the broken barrel. At the 35 gold remaining in the strongbox. Recasting costs 25 gold and bronze, I said. Yes. We'll have 10 gold left. Yes. Do it, I said. He nodded once and went back to his workshop. The second barrel came out of the mold 11 days later. Werner had added 4 millimeters of wall thickness at the breech, reinforced the touch hole sleeve with a separate iron insert, and changed the cooling process to reduce internal stress in the metal. He showed me the changes on the mold before we poured. We tested the second barrel on a Tuesday morning, same field, same target. 60 grams this time, not 80. Conservative. The ball went wide by 15 degrees. Werner's elevation screw was set slightly off-center, a measurement error in the carriage mount, not the barrel. He adjusted it. Third shot. The oak plank disintegrated. Werner stood in the field looking at the target frame. The oak plank was gone. The frame knocked back 3 meters, splinters scattered across the snow. 5 seconds of silence. This changes everything, he said. I know. And we need 7 more. In 6 weeks. He turned to look at me. 10 gold in reserve. Yes. If a second barrel fails, then we find another way, I said. But it won't. You know what you did wrong the first time. He looked at the target frame for another moment. Then back at his notes. 6 weeks, he said. 7 barrels. The second caster he'd hired, a man named Brandt from Salzhaven who had made church bells for 20 years and had the steady hands that work required, was already at the foundry when we returned. Werner explained the revised mold design. Brandt made 2 suggestions about the cooling rack that Werner accepted without comment, which told me more about Brandt's competence than anything he could have said himself. By mid-March, 8 barrels, 8 carriages, for 100 shells prepared and stored in the dry section of the East Granary. Total from the stamp mill over 4 months. 240 gold produced, 220 spent. 20 gold remaining. The math had worked, barely. If the war lasted more than 2 weeks, we'd be fighting on empty. Eisenstadt's envoy arrived in the 2nd week of March. He was a formal man, well-dressed, carrying a sealed letter and the posture of someone who expected his arrival to produce visible anxiety. He was shown to the main hall, offered tea, and sat across from me with the letter on the table between us. The letter demanded that Blumenthal estate cease all military fortification, surrender the artillery pieces whose existence had apparently reached Eisenstadt through his own intelligence network, acknowledge vassalage to the Count, and present a revised debt repayment schedule under the new terms this acknowledgement would imply. I read it twice, folded it, set it down. "I'd like to show you something," I said. We walked to the East Field. The envoy walked beside me with the expression of a man who was maintaining his composure professionally. The Eastern Battery was set up in a line at the field's edge, 8 guns on their carriages, loaded, aimed at a new target wall 250 meters out. Werner was standing at the far end of the line. I nodded to him. He fired the leftmost gun. The sound was extraordinary in the open air, not just the explosion but the compression of it, the way it pushed against the chest and ears simultaneously. The target wall, a construction of heavy timber that Werner had built specifically to withstand more than one shot, took the ball in its upper section and cracked visibly down the center. The envoy had taken 3 steps back without apparently deciding to. 8 of those, I said pleasantly. 400 rounds. Crews that have been training for 6 weeks. He looked at the gun, at the target, at the other 7 guns in the line. "The Count's offer," he started. "Please tell the Count that his offer has been noted and declined. The fortifications are defensive and legal. The artillery is our own property, built on our own land with our own materials. The debt repayment is proceeding exactly as agreed in the restructured schedule his own representative signed." I paused. "And tell him that the Eastern Redoubt has a very clear view of the main road from his estate." The envoy left before the afternoon. He didn't finish his tea. They came on a Thursday. Marta's network gave us 6 hours of warning. A rider from the laundry woman's contact, arriving before dawn with a single written line. "Moving today, all 4, dawn approach." 6 hours was enough. Werner was already at the Eastern Redoubt when I arrived. He had his arm in a sling. The shoulder had healed enough to use, but not enough to be comfortable, and was directing the gun crews with his left hand, pointing, adjusting elevation screws, checking powder charges. He'd been there since midnight. He hadn't told me he was going. "How are the crews?" I said. "Ready." The 3rd crew was slow on the reload yesterday. I worked them until they weren't. He didn't look away from the guns. "The East Field mines are set. Since Tuesday. The Western Redoubt. George has it. 40 men, good position." He nodded once. "Then we wait." They came down the main road in the way armies have always come down roads, in a column, organized at the front where the officers were, spreading out and loosening toward the rear where the conscripts walked. 400 men. The officers at the head were on horseback. I counted 7 horses, which told me the trained fighters were concentrated there. They saw the Eastern Redoubt from 400 meters. The column slowed. The officers conferred. I watched from the elevated position, Werner beside me, the gun crews crouched behind the parapet. "They're going around," Werner said quietly. "Yes." The column split, a deliberate movement, practiced. The bulk of the force left the road and spread into the eastern field, angling to come around the redoubt's flank. The officers knew what they were doing. Going around a fixed position was correct doctrine. You don't assault fortifications head-on if you have the numbers to envelop. What they didn't know was that we had spent 3 weeks in that field. The mines were simple, clay pots packed with powder charge, a friction igniter on a cord, buried at knee depth in a grid pattern across the field's natural approach line. Not designed to destroy, designed to produce one specific effect. The leading edge of Eisenstadt's force entered the field at a walk, confident. Spread out. The officers were calling orders. I pulled the first cord. 3 explosions, 20 meters apart, a half-second between each. Not large blasts. The charges were measured for noise and flash, not fragmentation. But in a field at dawn, with 400 men who had never heard gunpowder before, the effect was immediate and total. The horses went first. All 7 officers' horses, simultaneously, every one of them deciding in the same instant that this was not a situation to remain in. 3 threw their riders. 2 bolted north. The other 2 bolted south, into their own infantry, which produced a secondary chaos that I hadn't planned but appreciated. The infantry formation dissolved. Not retreated, dissolved. Men running in 4 directions, The officers on the ground shouting orders that nobody was positioned to hear or follow. The carefully maintained column structure gone in 15 seconds. The guns opened from the redoubt. Werner had given his crews one instruction: aim short. Hit the ground in front of them, not the men. The ball struck the field and threw up eruptions of frozen earth and noise, and the effect on men who were already running was to make them run faster and in more consistent directions away. We fired 12 rounds in 3 minutes. We hit 6 men, 2 seriously, for with fragment wounds that would heal. The point was not the 6 men. The point was the 400 men who were now not in formation on a road, whose officers were on foot or on runaway horses, whose understanding of what they were walking into had been revised completely and permanently in the span of 3 minutes. Marta had moved to the signal position on the redoubt's east tower. She was watching the road south with a looking glass. Eisenstadt is on foot, she called down. He's reforming near the tree line. Southeast. How many with him? A pause while she counted. Perhaps 150. The rest are still scattered. I looked at Werner. He was already calculating elevation adjustments for the range. Hold, I said. Not yet. The message from George came by runner at mid-morning. Asterisk 200 men, Western Road, reached the redoubt at the 7th hour. Assault attempted. We held. Klein is pulling back to the ridge. His reserve is not present. He committed everything to the first push. Request, 60 men for flanking movement, southwest approach, asterisk. I had 60 men positioned exactly there since Tuesday. I sent the runner back with one word, go. George's flanking force hit Klein's retreating column from the southwest while it was still trying to reform on the ridge. Not a pitched battle, a pressure application. 60 men making noise, moving fast, appearing where Klein's officers had calculated they weren't. The Western force, already shaken from the failed redoubt assault, read the situation as an encirclement and continued retreating. Klein's force was off the field by noon. The Western redoubt had held with 3 wounded. Werner's construction had done exactly what Werner had said it would do, made each entrance a problem that required solving under pressure. Klein had not solved it. Marta noted the time in her ledger. 30 meters of Western redoubt wall would need repairs where Klein's men had gotten close enough to use tools on the stone. She had already estimated the cost, 40 gold, 6 weeks. The 2 minor barons from the north had brought 150 men between them. They stopped at the crest of the northern hill at mid-morning and looked down at what was in front of them. From their position, they would have been able to see the eastern redoubt, which was still firing intermittent rounds into the tree line where Eisenstadt's remnant force was gathered. The smoke from the mine detonations, still visible in the still morning air. And this was the part Werner had suggested and I had agreed to immediately. The row of 7 remaining guns positioned on the open ground in front of the northern redoubt, visible from the hill, unmistakably what they were. They would also have been able to hear, carried on the cold air, the sound of the eastern guns. They stopped at the crest and did not come down. At the first hour of the afternoon, Marta's observer on the north ridge sent a signal, turning around. They left, all 150, back the way they'd come, their horses' hoofprints the only evidence they'd been there. I didn't pursue. I didn't send a message. I let them go, which would be a more useful thing later than anything a pursuit could accomplish. The south road, the one toward Reinhardt's port, the one they'd left open expecting us to run through, stayed empty all morning. Nobody came from that direction. Reinhardt had kept his agreement, which meant he had decided that a stable commercial partner was worth more than whatever Eisenstadt had offered him to look the other way. I made a note to send him a letter after this was over. Business, mostly, and one line acknowledging that his warning in the summer had mattered. He came at the second hour of the afternoon. He had reformed approximately 150 men from the scattered eastern force, the ones who had stayed close enough to find and who had enough discipline remaining to follow an order. He came back down the road directly, not through the field this time, the column tight and fast, moving with the specific energy of a man who has decided that the alternative to this is worse. I had 100 men behind the eastern redoubt wall, 8 guns, 180 rounds remaining of the 400 we'd prepared. Werner's shoulder was bleeding through the bandage again, but he was standing at the gun line, left hand on the elevation screw of the nearest piece, watching the road. Eisenstadt's column came to 200 meters and stopped. He was on a horse. He'd found one, or caught one of the bolted ones. He sat at the front of his column and looked at the redoubt, at the guns, at the flag Werner had put on the parapet at my request, the Blumenthal crest, which had not been used in any meaningful context for 2 generations. I climbed to the top of the parapet and stood where he could see me clearly. Count Eisenstadt. I called across the 200 meters. The morning had gone still, the way winter mornings go still after wind, and my voice carried. He looked at me. He knew who I was. We'd met once, formally, 2 years ago when he'd come to inspect the bridge construction he'd been trying to stop legally. You've lost 80 men, I said. Scattered, wounded, or gone. You have 150 behind you. I have 100 behind this wall, 200 more who can be here in 20 minutes, and 8 guns with 180 rounds remaining. I paused. #, your allies from the north turned around 2 hours ago. Klein is on his way home. You are alone on this road. The column behind him was very quiet. Or, I said, we can talk about why I offered you a partnership 3 years ago, and you chose this instead. A long silence. Long enough that Werner, beside me, said quietly, he's counting. He's always been counting, I said. He's just arriving at a different number than he expected. Eisenstadt sat on his horse for another 30 seconds. Then he reached up and removed his helmet. He held it at his side. It was a specific gesture, old enough to be understood by everyone on the road. I came down from the parapet and walked to the gate. While Eisenstadt was walking toward the gate with 2 of his remaining officers, I counted. Rounds expended, 180 of 400. The Eastern guns had done most of the work, 12 rounds in the opening phase, then controlled fire through the morning, then silence during the northern standoff, then the threat of 8 loaded guns on the road. Western redoubt, damaged. 40 gold to repair. 6 weeks. Werner, right shoulder reopened. He would need the arm rested for a month. He would not rest it for a month. This was a future problem. Our dead, one. His name was Peter Hausmann. He was 18 years old. He had been in August school for 3 years, had learned to read at 14, had been one of the 7 students who volunteered for the intelligence network in the autumn. He had asked, 3 weeks ago, to join the defense of the Western Redoubt rather than go south with the other students when the families were evacuated. I had said yes because he was 18 and it was his choice to make. He had been killed in the second hour of Klein's assault, when Klein's men had gotten close enough to the western wall to use pikes over the parapet. George had written the name in his report with a line underneath it and nothing else, which was the right way to write it. Marta had noted the name in her ledger. In the column she used for estate records, births, deaths, arrivals, departures, she had written, Peter Hausmann, age 18. School class 1. First literate peasant in estate history. Died in defense of Western Redoubt, 3rd day of March, *. I looked at that line for a long time before I went to meet Eisenstadt at the gate. Cash on hand, 20 gold. Redoubt repairs needed, 40 gold. Gap, 20 gold, minimum. We had won the battle and were technically insolvent. The terms of peace were not generosity. They were arithmetic. Eisenstadt came through the gate on foot, helmet in hand, 2 officers behind him. He was a large man, older than I remembered, the kind of large that has softened at the edges without losing its fundamental weight. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has revised his assessment of something completely and is deciding how much to show that. We sat in the main hall. Marta at the side table, ledger open, writing everything. I put the terms on the table. First, Eisenstadt formally recognized Blumenthal's territorial boundaries as defined in the Imperial Survey of the previous year. No future claims. No boundary disputes. Registered with the Imperial Surveyor within 30 days. Second, reparations of 1,000 gold, payable over 2 years, drawn from the same debt obligations he had purchased 3 years ago. He was, in effect, paying us back with our own debt. The symmetry was not accidental. Third, the alliance document, the mutual defense agreement signed in October, to be formally dissolved, with copies of the dissolution sent to each signatory and to the Imperial Record Office. Eisenstadt read the terms. He read them again. The 1,000 gold, he said, is less than your military expedition cost you, I said. Horses, equipment, wages, provisions. You've spent more than that to be sitting in this room. He looked at the paper. The boundary recognition cost you nothing you actually have. The disputed sections were never productively yours. You know this. A long silence. One of his officers leaned toward him and said something quietly. Eisenstadt shook his head slightly. The alliance dissolution, he said. Klein and the others won't like it. Klein is currently explaining to his own household why he left 200 men on a ridge and came home without fighting. He is not in a strong position to dislike anything. I paused. The dissolution protects you too. If the imperial administration decides to investigate the alliance as an act of aggression against an estate operating under imperial charter, which it was, you want to be able to show a dissolved agreement, not an active one. He looked at me. Something in his face shifted, not warmth, not quite. The specific expression of a man who has just realized he has been outmaneuvered at a level he hadn't been tracking. You thought about the imperial administration, he said. I think about everything, I said. Usually earlier than the people across from me. Another silence. He picked up the pen. He signed. Marta witnessed. I witnessed. The two officers witnessed because they were there, and it was better to have them on the document than not. When they left, Eisenstadt and his 150 men back up the eastern road, slower going home than coming. Werner appeared in the doorway of the hall. His sling was bloodied. He was holding a piece of paper. I've started the design for the 9th gun, he said. The barrel profile on the 8th is slightly off. I want to correct it in the next casting. I looked at him, at his arm, at the paper. Werner, I said, we just won a war. Yes, he said, and the 8th gun isn't accurate enough. He sat down at the table and started drawing. 3 years. I sat at the desk where father used to not sleep, in the chair where he used to sit with cold tea and no plan, and I counted. 3 years ago, 80 dying peasants. 40 gold in the strongbox. A debt of 4,000 that I couldn't pay in 100 years at the estate's existing trajectory. A neighbor who had been buying our obligations and waiting for the collapse with the patience of a man who has done this before. Now, 1,200 people across 5 villages, all of them with clean water, written contracts, and children in school. Roads that don't break carts. A bridge generating 30 gold per month whether I sleep or not. A gold vein producing 60. A farm complex that feeds everyone and sells the surplus to Dietrich at market rate. 8 guns. Werner would say 9. He was finishing the casting this week. And a western redoubt that needs 40 gold of repair that the first reparations payment would cover with room to spare. And Graf Eisenstadt, who had waited 3 years for us to collapse, had signed a document in this hall 2 weeks ago that obligated him to pay us 1,000 gold drawn from our own former debt. I wrote the number down, the way Marta had taught me to write everything down. Then I sat back and looked at it. The team at the end of year 3. Marta ran the estate like a mechanism she had built herself, which was accurate. She had built most of it. She knew every family, every contract, every outstanding obligation, every opportunity within 40 kilometers. She had started keeping a second ledger 6 months ago, separate from the estate accounts, that she hadn't explained to me. When I asked, she said, for later. I didn't ask again. Marta's later had always arrived on schedule. Werner was in the foundry. He was always in the foundry now. The 9th gun was coming out of the mold this week. He had told me the barrel profile on the 8th was 3 millimeters off true, and this bothered him in the way that imprecision bothers men who have spent their lives measuring things carefully. His shoulder had healed enough that he was using both hands again, though the right one tired faster than it used to. He didn't mention this. I noticed it. August had 61 students enrolled for the spring term. The first graduating class, 12 students, ages 17 to 19, had received their final certificates in February, 3 weeks before the war. Peter Hausmann's certificate was in the school's record book. August had written his name and himself in the careful script he used for important documents, and had left the line for employment destination blank. He hadn't filled it in. He wasn't going to. 11 of the 12 graduates had asked for positions on the estate. Marta had already placed 9 of them, 2 in the accounts office, 3 in construction management under George, 2 as bridge toll supervisors, 2 as village record keepers. The work they were doing was work that had not existed 3 years ago because there had been no one to do it. Dietrich came on a Wednesday, not for trade. He came in the late afternoon on a horse he'd ridden himself, without his usual cart or his clerk, and he sat across from me in the hall and didn't speak immediately, which was unusual for Dietrich, who was a man who used silence economically. People are talking about you in the capital, he said finally. Merchants talk. Not merchants. He set a sealed envelope on the table between us. The wax was red. The impression in it was not a merchant's mark. Lords. And not just talking. The Imperial Council held a session last month. The agenda item, he paused, was titled, The Blumenthal Phenomenon, Threat or Model. I looked at the envelope. Half of them want to replicate what you've done, Dietrich said. The other half want to stop you before it spreads. Because if it spreads, the people who profit from keeping peasants poor and sick lose that profit. Permanently. He pushed the envelope toward me. Imperial seal. My name on the front in the formal hand of a court secretary. You're summoned to the capital, he said. 3 weeks. I looked at the envelope for a long moment. I thought about father sleeping soundly in the next room for the first time in years. About Marta's second ledger, the one for later. About Werner finishing the 9th gun this week because the 8th one wasn't accurate enough. About Peter Hausmann's certificate with the blank employment line. I picked up the envelope. Marta, I said. She was in the doorway. She had been in the doorway since Dietrich arrived, which meant she had been listening, which meant she already knew. I heard, she said. You're in charge while I'm gone. Full authority, all accounts. She nodded. She had already decided this. Werner. He was behind her in the corridor. I didn't know how long he'd been there either. Finish the 9th gun before I leave. I want it done. It will be done, he said. It was always going to be done. I broke the seal. Dietrich, I said, reading. I need a map of the capital, and a list of every council member who has outstanding debt obligations, failing harvests, or supply chain problems I might be able to solve. Dietrich smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. I already made that list, he said. On the ride here. I looked up at him. I've been doing business with you for 2 years, he said. I know how you work. I set the letter down. Then let's get to work, I said.